Can you actually smell how someone is feeling? I mean, not just noticing they've been working out, but actually sensing their emotional state through their body odor. It sounds pretty out there, doesn't it? But the sources we're digging into today suggest, well, body odor might be doing a lot more than just smelling like, body odor.
That's exactly right. What the research really points to is that these body odors, especially from places like our armpits, they function as chemical signals, often called chemosignals. So think of them less as just random scents and more as carriers of actual information about the person producing them.
Okay, and the sources show these chemosignals can give us some pretty basic info, right? Like hints about, say, gender, age, maybe diet, or even if someone's unwell.
Precisely. Those are some of the baseline things. But the truly fascinating layer, and what we're really focusing on in this deep dive, is the evidence that these chemical signals can also transmit information about specific emotional states. We're talking about potentially picking up on happiness, fear, anxiety, aggression, even disgust, just through smell.
Okay, so for you, the listener, our mission today is really unpack what these sources are telling us about this hidden chemical communication of emotions. We'll dive into how it works, what emotions seem to translate into scent, and we'll look particularly at stress signals and their kind of surprising potential links to conditions like depression. We're aiming to cut through the noise here, just give you the core insights from this, well, pretty wild area of research.
Yeah, and what's remarkable is how this ability, this potential ability to communicate emotions via scent seems to complement the ways we already do it. Through our tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, this chemical layer, it seems to have some adaptive value, potentially helping us recognize emotions faster, maybe even fostering empathy in others.
Okay, let's unpack that. How does simple sweat actually become something that carries emotional information? Where does the smell part come from?
It's actually a multi-step biochemical process. The sources describe it, and honestly, it's pretty clever. It starts with a precursor compound, something produced inside the sweat glands themselves. Now, this compound, it's odorless at this stage, gets released onto the skin surface in the sweat. Still odorless, but here's the key part. This is where those bacteria that live on your skin come into play. Certain specific bacteria actually metabolize this odorless precursor. They basically break it down. And that bacterial action is what releases the volatile odorous compound, the thing we can actually detect by smell.
Whoa, hold on. So my body sweat isn't just making a smell on its own. It's more like I'm providing the raw ingredients, and the bacteria on my skin are like tiny chefs that unlock the actual scent. That's genuinely surprising.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. The bacteria are essential partners in creating the smell we can detect. And researchers have definitely been putting this to the test, in lab conditions, trying to see if humans can actually detect and then respond to these emotional odors. They've looked at quite a range of emotional states.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. What kind of effects, what responses have they actually measured? When people are exposed to this emotional sweat in studies, what happens when you smell someone else's fear or their happiness?
Well, the sources give some pretty specific examples, smelling fear odor, for instance. It's been linked in some studies to distinct behavioral responses, like activating the facial muscles we associate with fear expressions, just from smelling it.
Activating the muscles. So, you might start to look scared yourself.
Potentially, yes. Or at least show micro-expressions related to fear. And even more specifically, some research found people were actually faster to recognize fearful facial expressions on a screen after smelling fear odor compared to smelling neutral sweat.
Faster recognition.
But, and here's a twist, that effect wasn't always super specific just to fear.
Right. I did notice that sources mentioned some mixed findings there. It's not quite a perfect one-to-one signal then.
Precisely. That's a really crucial nuance to understand. Other studies show less specificity. Fear odor, in some experiments, influenced responses not just to fearful faces, but also to angry or even happy and neutral faces. And similarly, one study found that anxious odor influenced how people perceived happy faces. So whether the odor's effect is always perfectly matched to the emotion it came from, that's still very much an open question in the research, still being explored.
Okay.
The sources also point to the brain areas involved, how we process these odors that seem to tap into our emotions and physical states. They mention the amygdala, which makes sense. It's key for processing emotions, especially things like fear and threat. And the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC, that helps us evaluate sensory input and link it to how we're feeling inside. And interestingly, these odors can also get sort of woven into memory thanks to the hippocampus, meaning a smell could potentially trigger an emotional memory down the line.
That makes sense for, social interaction, how we react to people. But do these emotional chemosignals have any deeper relevance? Maybe for mental health conditions?
That's a really important question, and yes, the sources do touch upon that. They discuss findings linking how our brains process these kinds of smells to certain psychiatric conditions. For instance, one study found that in people with panic disorder, stress chemosignals led to increased activity in a specific brain area, the inferior frontal gyrus. And this increased activity actually correlated with how severe their panic symptoms were, which suggests it might relate to maybe an oversensitivity to potential threat signals in their environment.
Interesting. And oversensitivity.
Yeah, and there's also some speculation about a connection between conditions like autism and processing these chemical signals. The idea being floated is that difficulties in smelling or processing these human social chemosignals, sometimes called social dysosmia, might perhaps play a role in some of the social challenges faced by adults with autism.
Social dysosmia.
Yep.
And you mentioned depression earlier. What did the research you focused on specifically look at there in relation to depression?
Right. So one particular study we drew from, its main aim was to compare how individuals with diagnosed depression and healthy control participants reacted when they were exposed to stress chemosignals. The kind collected from armpit sweat during a stressful event.
Okay, what do they expect to find?
Well, their hypothesis was based on some previous findings. They reasoned that, okay, stress chemosignals are transmitted, and maybe they could, perhaps subconsciously, improve how the receiver processes information and recognizes emotions in others, sort of sharpen perception.
Improved processing. Okay.
But here's the really surprising part of their hypothesis. They predicted this effect might be particularly noticeable, maybe even beneficial, in the individuals with depression.
Beneficial, how so?
Their thinking, based on the sources, was that maybe these instinctive responses triggered by the stress smells might make the depressed individuals less reliant on their own internal mood state, which can be negative, and more focused on the external information, like the task of recognizing emotions, potentially improving their performance on those tasks.
Wait, hang on. So they actually thought that smelling someone else's stress might help people with depression recognize emotions better? That seems really counterintuitive.
I agree. It is a fascinating and somewhat unexpected hypothesis. It wasn't pulled out of thin air, though. It built on previous research suggesting that, for example, fear chemosignals could enhance certain perceptual and cognitive processing. So they were testing if this sort of enhancement effect held true for stress signals, and specifically if it might somehow counteract some of the cognitive or emotional processing differences often seen in depression.
Okay. Before we get to what they actually found in that study, how do researchers even collect these smells? I mean, how do you get stress sweat versus neutral sweat in a way that's scientifically sound? It sounds complicated.
It definitely requires controlled methods, yeah. The sources describe the standard approach pretty clearly. It usually involves having donors wear absorbent pads, typically right in their armpits, for a set period to collect the sweat.
Right, the pads.
Right.
Makes sense.
And then, to induce the specific emotional state in the donor-like stress for the depression study, they use validated protocols. The depression study used something called the Trier Social Stress Test, the TSST. It involves things like public speaking and doing mental arithmetic, all under pressure. It's known to reliably create psychosocial stress. And they compared the sweat from that to sweat collected during a friendly, non-stressful control version of the task, the FTSST.
And they checked if the donors were actually stressed.
Absolutely crucial. They don't just assume. The source confirms they measured physiological markers, things like cortisol levels in saliva or blood. And yes, they found higher cortisol in the donors during the stress test compared to the control condition, so it verified the stress induction worked.
Okay, and what about the control smells? What do they compare the stress sweat to?
Good question. It varies. For comparison in these studies, they use different control conditions for the sweat samples. Sometimes it's sweat collected during neutral physical activity, like riding an exercise bike. Other times it might be sweat collected while the donor watches a boring, non-emotional video, or even just unused cotton pads as a baseline.
Gotcha. So it sounds like the methods both for getting the emotion going and collecting the control samples, they can vary quite a bit between different studies.
Absolutely. That's a key point. A systematic review mentioned in the sources really highlighted this heterogeneity. Big word, but it just means variety. Methods differ in how they induce emotions, could be watching films, doing extreme sports, not just the TSST. What stimulus they use, usually sweat, but sometimes even tear samples, as tears apparently also contain chemosignals.
Tears too.
Yeah. And also how they measure the response in the person smelling the sample. But they do typically try to confirm the donor's emotional state using standardized self-report scales too, like the state trait anxiety inventory, just to double check the emotion induction subjectively as well.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from the sources,
Yeah.
what's the big picture emerging here?
Well, the overall picture is that there's growing and pretty strong evidence, at least from these laboratory studies, showing that our body odor does indeed change with our emotional state. That seems quite clear. And under these controlled conditions, humans can detect and respond to these emotional odors, even if we're not always consciously aware of it.
And the implications?
Well, the sources raise some really fascinating potential implications. For example, the suggestion that maybe specific odorants, the ones capable of triggering particular emotional responses, might, and this is highly speculative still, might have some therapeutic potential down the line for psychological issues, maybe like depression, but that's a big leap from where the research is now.
Right. So what does this all ultimately mean for us just living our lives? Are we just walking around in this invisible cloud of emotional smells, constantly influencing each other without realizing it?
That really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? While the lab evidence is compelling and growing, the sources rightly emphasize the need for, well, significant caution when we try to extrapolate these findings directly to everyday life. Whether we actually use these subtle emotional odors for communication on a really meaningful scale, out there in the complex real world,
Right.
that still needs a lot more robust investigation. It's harder to study outside the lab.
Makes sense. Lots of other smells and distractions out there.
Exactly. And the sources are very clear about the limitations and challenges still facing this field. Things like standardizing the methods across labs, really understanding the true size of these odor effects in natural settings, and, of course, digging much deeper into the underlying biological and psychological mechanisms. How does it really work?
Wow. So it turns out our noses might be picking up on a whole hidden layer of communication, just happening beneath the surface of our everyday interactions. It's like a silent conversation happening under our noses, literally.
Indeed. It suggests the sense of smell, which we humans often consider less important than sight or hearing. It appears to play a far more significant role in our social and emotional signaling than maybe we've previously appreciated. And yes, these findings do carry potential relevance, as we discussed, for understanding complex conditions like depression.
So for you, the listener, this deep dive really reveals that even something as seemingly simple as body odor is incredibly complex. It's packed with information. It's carrying these subtle signals that could potentially influence our own emotions, how we perceive other people, and maybe even our mental well-being in ways we're only just beginning to map out.
Right. And maybe a final provocative thought for you to consider. If we can subtly smell emotions like stress, and if this unconscious chemical communication might influence how we process emotions or connect socially, how might this impact our daily interactions? Especially perhaps for individuals whose own emotional or social processing might already be altered, maybe by something like depression or anxiety or autism. How does that unconscious layer interact with everything else? What stands out to you?